Hello and welcome back to Litcast. In this episode, we're going to be exploring what is arguably one of the most important messages and themes in an Inspector Calls, that of responsibility. So most of the characters have a vague idea of what it means to be responsible. But it tends to be quite narrow. The inspector provides us with this much broader idea. Mr. Burling feels that it's his responsibility to look after his family and his business. And that means, for him, making as much money as possible, even if that means hurting other people or being quite harsh in dealing with his employees in particular. As a family man, he has this responsibility to provide for the material needs of his family, and there is, of course, pressure for him to do that. Yet it's clear that Eric does not see him as the kind of father that he could turn to when in trouble. So his responsibility doesn't necessarily extend to emotional availability. Now, this is quite useful when you're thinking about themes. Try and think about how each of the themes relates to each of the characters and also how the theme relates to context. Now, I mentioned in the last episode where we explored themes that and Inspector Calls is great for this because the themes inevitably link to context. The play is so entrenched in its own context that you can't avoid it. So thinking about the themes in relation to context should be quite straightforward, and then just thinking about how each of the characters relates to or embodies that theme, even if that means that they don't. So, Mr. Burling doesn't take responsibility in a lot of different ways, but he still has a view of what responsibility is, and thinking about how he embodies and also disassociates from responsibility can be really useful. So Mrs. Burling accepts her responsibility as chair of the women's charity organisation. But again, if you think about her role, it's probably a kind of figurehead societal role, and it's probably seen as something that is charitable, so looks good to other people. So the responsibility is there in as far as she needs to be seen to be doing something. But also it's that sense of power, right? So it's responsibility that comes with the power, and she's more interested in the power to decide who deserves help and who doesn't than responsibility. She allows her personal feelings to prejudice her decisions, and Sheila belatedly recognises that as a powerful customer, she also had those prejudices, and she had an obligation not to let her personal feelings and ill temper lead to misery for the shop workers, but she did. And Eric has little sense of responsibility at all. Now, whether that is because of how he's been brought up, where he's been given money, but also not really encouraged to develop interests or motivation. His parents don't really seem to think a lot of him. So because of that, maybe he doesn't really feel any sense of responsibility or share any sense of responsibility. And he drinks far more than is good for him, and he forces the girl into a relationship. And of course, that has disastrous consequences for all involved. And then him stealing from his father also shows he doesn't really have any responsibility towards his family or loyalty towards his family. Gerald shows a certain amount of responsibility in that he rescues the girl so Daisy Renton at the time, from Alderman Meggerty. But that comes at the cost of her then having to repay him by staying with him for 6 months and being there to satisfy his own desire for personal pleasure. So even then, he has this sort of superficial responsibility, but then the expectation is that she has a responsibility to repay him in some way. So it's not a truly altruistic level of responsibility there to help those in need. And he doesn't really then care what happens to her. So again, did he really take responsibility for her if he didn't really care what happened to her afterwards? So clearly, responsibility is one of the most important messages in the play, and it's referred to as both responsibility and public duty in the play by the inspector and others. The inspector, speaking for Priestley, wants to demonstrate how every action and interaction can have an impact on others. So through Eva Smith, who really, when it comes to the inspector, is a device, because he only shows the photograph to one person at a time. He controls that narrative, which leads into another theme we'll talk about in our next episode. And what he does is he shows individually how these people did not deal with the situation at hand in a responsible fashion. They did not take responsibility, and now they should be taking responsibility for their actions. And these series of wrongs ultimately brings about that tragic consequence. So you'll be able to divide the responsibility between you when I'm gone, he says. Eva Smith is not the only victim of these interactions, because as a result of these thoughtless actions, Mr. Burling is going to forfeit his knighthood, Mrs. Burling's going to lose her position as head of the women's charity, Eric is probably going to be arrested. Even if they don't mention the sexual assault, he will be charged with fraud. And Gerald may have lost Sheila for good. And Sheila has been affected hugely already. She's never going to recover from the guilt that she now feels. So all of them have had consequences from their lack of responsibility. And it's useful to also think about contrasts, which we'll talk a little bit about again in a later episode. But there are some stark contrasts that you'll see, and we've mentioned it a few times already, but the generational divide, the contrast between the older and the younger members of the cast, and how they are responding to the inspector, and the level of responsibility they take and remorse that they feel. All right, so that is just a few minutes on the theme of responsibility in An Inspector Calls. There's so much wound up in there about this concept of responsibility. It links so heavily with the context, in particular around socialism and the idea of a welfare state and being societally responsible for each other. So there's a really lovely connection there that you can explore too. Thank you very much for listening in. We'll be back with another episode on another theme of An Inspector Calls very soon, and I will see you then. Listening to Litcast, the podcast for GCSE and A-level revision. The music that you hear in this episode is called Galaxy and was written by Ixon, and you can find the rest of his music on SoundCloud. You can also find us on other social media channels, including YouTube, where you'll also find our Litcast live episodes. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope to see you again.